Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I'm Rabbi Jenny Greenspan for Congregation Beth-El. Say good morning and welcome. We're having our weekly Shabbat morning Torah Talk. This week, unfortunately, we were not able to get the PDF of our Etz Chaim Chumash, but I will suggest, if you are joining me and would like a virtual resource for our Torah portion, to go to sefaria.org, sefaria.org, and you can navigate through Tanakh, Genesis, and I will be today in chapter 21, which is in the middle of this morning's Torah portion. So if you would like to follow along with me virtually on Sefaria, it's a really user-friendly database of a massive Jewish library, and is worth poking around for lots of things. But I will suggest that you join me there if you'd like to follow along with me in the Torah portion this morning, rather than on that PDF, because as I said, unfortunately, we weren't able to get the PDF of this week's Torah portion. If you do have a physical Etz Chaim Chumash, feel free to grab that this morning as well. If you have a physical Etz Chaim, I will be on page 114 when we get to it. But first, I want to say Shabbat Shalom and welcome to everybody. I see we now have anniversary badges, anniversary followers. We've been at this for more than a year. It's been kind of fun to see you each Shabbat morning in this mode and reflect a little bit on our Torah portion together. So say Shabbat Shalom and good morning to the Seagulls, to Phyllis Luger, to Marcia, and to Bruce the Sclares, to Ellen Hamburger, to James Roth, Jim Hammonds, Shabbat Shalom to Michael Kahn, to Carol Steinfeld, to Marty Lip, and to Jody Zucker. So good to see my usual Shabbat morning crowd here in the comments and otherwise online. No need to comment, but a Shabbat Shalom to you as well if you are not comfortable letting me know you're there, but I know that you are. So I'll say Shabbat Shalom, and I'm so glad that so many of us are able to study and learn a little bit together each Shabbat morning. So this week we are in Parashat Vayera, which has many of the most famous stories involving Abraham. Abraham's stories really spread between last week, this week, and next week. We'll wind him down next week as we move into Isaac, his son, as a story. But this week has some of the more famous stories about Abraham, including his greeting guests from his open tent, wanting to allow them in the heat of the day and giving them a space to be and to rest. We see him argue with God to save the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, arguing God down from if there are 50 righteous down to even if there are just 10 righteous. He does ultimately have to give in, and God does ultimately destroy the two cities, but we see his example as being someone who challenges God on behalf of others. And then we see some of the more painful stories involving his own family. We see one of which we will focus on today. We see him and his wife Sarah struggling to have the child that has been promised to them by now twice. And so we see the son of Hagar, the Egyptian servant, involved and then cast out, which is where we will focus this morning. We then see the birth and weaning. We see the birth and weaning of Isaac, of Sarah's son. We see Hagar and Ishmael, her son, cast out of the house. We see Abraham nearly sacrifice his son in a moment of religious fervor, of deep yirah, deep awe and fear for God. And that's where our Torah portion will then conclude, leading into next week's Torah portion. There's a lot to process in this week's Torah portion, each story deserving its own attention. And so if you would like to take the time, it begins, if you are on Sefaria, not in a Chumash, it begins with Genesis chapter 18 and goes through chapter 22, each story deserving its own time for study. But this week I will take up the call from the National Council of Jewish Women, with whom I have signed on as a rabbi for reproductive justice. And I will thank Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg for sharing an interpretation with me that she's asked that we share as widely as possible as as I at least, fight for reproductive health care, which is permitted by Jewish law, even required with the health of the pregnant person at stake. So I want to look a little bit at the context of Hagar and Ishmael, which is why we'll be in Genesis chapter 1, beginning at verse 9. If you are using an Etz Chaim Chumash, it's on page 114. If you are on Sefaria, all you have to do to get there is click Tanakh, and then Genesis, and then you can select chapter 21 and scroll down to verse 9. For the context, we are immediately after the birth and weaning of our patriarch Isaac, and we are seeing Sarah watching Hagar, the Egyptian servant, and her son. And we'll also point out where in this story, Ishmael, the son of Hagar, has already been born. But there's a bit of a backstory that's also required that was toward the end of last week's Torah portion, which was when God promised that Abraham would be the father of a large nation, and Sarah struggled to get pregnant. Hagar was taken from Sarah's tent and given into Abraham's. She was not asked. She had no agency. She was taken and she was given. And so she ends up with a child, Ishmael, who will become the father of what we today consider the Muslim nation. But here we see this painful story. Begin with me in verse 9. Sarah saw the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham playing. That word for playing is an unusual one, and I believe I spoke about it last year. So if you want to go back about a year ago and look at a deeper dive into that word, it's unclear what it really means. But playing, it comes from the same root for laughter, so it may be playing, it may be a more intense or potentially inappropriate, but it may be something a little bit beyond just like playing a game. But I would encourage looking back to last year for a deeper dive into that word, as it's not what I want to focus on this morning. So Sarah saw the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham playing. She said to Abraham, "Cast out that slave woman and her son, for the son of that slave shall not share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." The matter distressed Abraham greatly, for it concerned a son of his. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed over the boy or your slave. Whatever Sarah tells you, do as she says, for it is through Isaac that the offspring shall be continued for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him too, for he is your seed." Early next morning, Abraham took some bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He placed them on her shoulder together with her child and sent her away. She wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water was gone from the skin, she left the child under one of the bushes, and went and sat down at a distance, a bow shot away, for she thought, "Let me not look on as this child dies." And sitting thus far, she burst into tears. Pause here, point out, so we now have a woman who was not given any agency as to whether or not she wanted to have this child, who has now been cast out with no means of caring for this child. Just to hold that for the moment. God heard the cry of the boy, and an angel of God called to Hagar from the heavens and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heeded the cry of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him by the hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and let the boy drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up, and he dwelt in the wilderness and became a bowman. He lived in the wilderness of Paran. His mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Here's the end of this story, which we also do read on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. We see this story. They will point out where we have come so far. Hagar was taken and given with no agency. She was thrown out into the wilderness, which at the time, to put a woman and a child out into the wilderness with nothing more than a skin of water and a little bit of food, is to offer a death sentence, is to say that they have no resources. And she is left again, with no means to care for the child that she was never asked if she wanted, but whom she loves deeply. So painful. The story is so painful that she cannot watch what might happen to him. Sister Strong, a woman of color reproductive justice collective, defines reproductive justice as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, to have children or not to have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. Reproductive justice brings a racial and economic justice framework to the work for reproductive freedom, recognizing and addressing disparities in social, economic, and political power, and how this impacts across to reproductive health care. The work for reproductive justice was started and continues to be led, especially by women of color. Hagar, as an Egyptian maidservant, would be similar in our modern context to that outsider and insider who needs to work hard. Hagar did not have the right to make decisions about whether to have children or the right or ability to parent the child that she did have in a safe and a sustainable way. She was not given access to justice by our own forefather Abraham in this particular story. And today we cannot take those rights for granted. So many work so hard and worked so hard to give us the opportunities to reach that justice, and many of those rights are under attack. Hagar's cry to God is heeded by God, and Ishmael, whose name is never mentioned in this story, his cry too is heeded by God, and the two of them are saved. And Ishmael, in the end of the story, does find a career and a wife and is able to go on and grow. But we cannot rely on that today. We must be the call for justice and for freedom. We must follow Abraham's earlier example in this Torah portion in Sodom and Gomorrah, to continue to say, this is a religious right to us, as I opened with, sometimes required by Jewish law in order to save a mother or a parent if the health of the pregnant person is at stake. The Jewish law would require us to be able to save that person, the life already living. It's a painful notion to have to be in those moments of making those decisions, but we must be able to make those decisions, to ask for God's help and to ask for one another's help. And so we cannot rely on a cry of another, of the one in pain, to change what is. Rather, we must continue to fight and grow. And so I hope this week we take the example of Abraham, who stood up to God and to power at Sodom and Gomorrah, rather than Abraham, who denied Hagar, Abraham and Sarah, who denied Hagar her own agency. May we have a week where we recognize where justice needs work, where we recognize one another's agency, and where we work to build a stronger humanity, where everyone has all the rights that they need and everyone has the ability to parent the children they have and want sustainably and healthfully and growthfully. So I'll say Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for joining Larry Spector and Julia Whitehead. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much for being with me. And if you wish to read Rabbi Rutenberg's words a little further and to look at some of the other points that she makes with things that are currently happening, I encourage you to go to ncjw.org, the National Council for Jewish Women.org, ncjw. I'll say Shabbat Shalom, and I will look forward to seeing you soon. Our services will begin at 10 o'clock in the sanctuary or on our live stream. Shabbat Shalom.